So we originally planned this talk to connect up with Stoic Week, which is over, but we're at least in the same month as it. There's a big growing movement of people interested in Stoic philosophy and in applying it to modern life. So just to give you an idea, at StoicCon we had about, which was around the middle of the month, we had about 330 people show up. It was the largest gathering of Stoics in history. And there's something like 20 or 30,000 people on Stoicism Reddit. There's 16,000 on the Stoicism group in Facebook. And most of them are not students. Most of them are people who are working because they're finding Stoicism useful for them in one way or another. So this talk is about Stoicism as a moral theory. It's part of an ethics class, so I figured it would nicely dovetail with what you guys are doing. And I'd like you to think about some of the other things that you've been studying in your ethics class, some of the examples, and we'll see if we can apply them to Stoicism. I've reserved some time for questions and answer and discussion at the end, but I'm also, pretty happy to answer questions along the way, anything that's unclear. I may take a pause here and there and see if there are any questions. So let's talk first about really big picture stuff. Where does Stoic ethics fit in with moral theories, the sorts of things that you're studying in an ethics class? A lot of people view Stoicism as a particular kind of virtue ethics. And that makes good sense because you see them talking about these cardinal virtues like wisdom and temperance or moderation, courage, justice. I think you've encountered these in other moral theories, right? So that makes a lot of sense. And then there's also a strong emphasis on themes that come up with what we call deontological ethics. Have you guys covered deontology yet?
This is the intro class, mind you. So have you guys, how much of that moral theories, classical moral theories have you guys?
It's one of the big, ones that you encounter.
I know we have in our class.
Yeah, so deontological theories tend to focus primarily on duty, on the notion of obligation, on doing what you ought to do, what's right. And the Stoics really stress that as well. There's also certain other key themes like human freedom, figuring out what sort of laws or rules you ought to obey that fit in with that as well. One thing that you can say that the Stoics were definitely opposed to are what we call hedonistic ethics. Ethics that say that pleasure is the good, pain is the bad. The Stoics were some of the strongest opponents of that in ancient times, and they remain so, I think, in the present. At the same time, if we don't look just at pleasure and pain, but at other goods, sometimes the Stoics look like what we call utilitarians, where they try to look at the outcomes across the board and see what will work out well for, you could call it the system as a whole or the community as a whole. But they're not thinking about that primarily in terms of pain and pleasure. They're thinking about that in terms of other things. And the last thing to say about this is you may not encounter what's called natural law theory in an intro class, or even in an ethics class. It depends on how it's being taught, and there's a lot of material that has to be crammed into 15 weeks, so we often have to carry out a kind of triage of cutting things off. But the Stoics are one of the first people to start talking in pretty robust terms about natural law. And by natural law, what they mean is that there would be a kind of moral structure written into or built into the fabric of the universe and the structure of the human person that you could uncover through reason and then start applying. And there's a lot more to it than that, but that's sort of a thumbnail sketch. The other thing I want to say sort of in preparation is we ought to think about what it is that we want moral theories to do for us. People take an ethics class in general because they have to, right? It's a required course at some places. Some of the professions that you'll go on to have codes of ethics that you'll be expected to, if not memorize, at least don't get in trouble with, don't transgress. Oftentimes ethics is looked at as something that's, imposed upon us. It's really good for us to study ethics. And all of you are going to find that out as you move into your professions. Now, you could study moral theories just because they're intrinsically interesting. That's not something that I think appeals to most people. That does appeal to me, and that's how people become academics. But I think most people are interested in more practical matters, right? So what are those? Some of those have to do with understanding how to distinguish good and bad and right from wrong. And why? Because those are difficult things when you get into real life situations to make sense of. If it was easy, if you could just sort of consult, your gut, well, then you wouldn't need ethics at all. It would be built into you. But it doesn't work that way, as you find out when you run into real situations. And in general, it's not just about evaluating actions. Is this action right or wrong, good or bad? It also extends to thinking about the kind of persons that we are, and our motivations, and things like our emotions and relationships. All of those fall within the scope of ethics. We really want to understand moral theory well when we get into difficult situations. And unfortunately, if we haven't spent much time, not necessarily studying ethics in an academic way, but at least thinking about these sorts of things, playing them in our head, reflecting on these sorts of things. When we get into difficult situations, it's pretty hard to learn on the fly. If we're really lucky, we have somebody else who's a great counselor or advisor to give us some useful, principles or proverbs or whatever you want to call it, or even to hold our hand and walk us through something. That's not usually the case. Most of the time we're on our own. So it's important to have some sort of ethical grounding. It's not enough, you might say, to have a moral compass. You actually need to know how to use that compass to navigate through the forest. Anybody can have a moral compass, although I think some people's are probably in better shape than others. So we want ethics to help us out when we're faced with temptations. And I think in your class you've probably talked about some of these things that come up. Some of them are very common to students, right? Like thinking about should you go to a party or should you study on a Saturday night? That can be an ethical question, right? Especially if you have an obligation to your team to do well in your joint project or something along those lines. Opposition by others. It's not just that you're going to get tempted to do things. You're going to encounter active opposition from other people telling you that what you think is good is actually bad and you shouldn't do it, or vice versa. So that's important to be able to handle. We do run into genuine moral dilemmas from time to time, usually because things have gotten screwed up. There's a whole literature out there on moral dilemmas that's very interesting. Some people say they don't really exist. I think they really do. Why do they exist? Well, we get ourselves into messy situations, and then we have to figure out what we're doing. So ethics can give us a nice, bigger picture way of looking at things. It can give us some ideals by which we can orient ourselves. It can tell us, or at least it should tell us, what the good for human beings is and how we can work towards that. Or, as I like to put it, a lot of times ethics is not just about this, can we measure up to our ideals? It's also about, well, we managed to really screw things up. Now how do we unscrew them over time, and how do we know that we're not getting ourselves deeper into the mess? That's also part of ethics, and the Stoics will talk about that. The other thing that ethics ought to do is help us identify, both in general and in our particular cases, what obstacles are standing in our way when it comes to personal development, when it comes to doing the right thing, when it comes to thinking things through. So the Stoics have a lot to say about all those different things. They're not the only people who do. There's plenty of other great schools and approaches that you should study, but I think the Stoics have some interesting things to offer. So before we go into some of the meat, any questions about or comments about this so far? Issues, objections, worries? No? All right. Well, let's jump in. I'm giving you a real thumbnail sketch, And when we say thumbnail sketch, think of like a video thumbnail. You really can't see much of anything on it, can you? You can see maybe a little, tiny thing there. You could blow up a thumbnail, but it's usually very pixelated. That's the way this sketch is going to be. We're not going to, in the 30 minutes that remain to us, walk through the entirety of Stoic ethics. So we're going to hit on 4 main things and try to do those fairly well, and I'll answer any questions that you have along the way about these. So let's talk about the good and the bad. This is really fundamental. The Stoics are, you might say, hardliners, and they were understood as hardliners even in ancient times, and they are even so today, including for the modern adapters of Stoicism who often seem to want to shave off some of the rough edges or make it a little bit easier to adapt to modern life. The Stoics thought that what's fundamentally good is at the core of the human person. It's not out there in the world, except in a derivative sense. It's not in money. It's not in pleasure. It lies in what they called virtue. And that's an old-fashioned term. You guys have been hopefully introduced to it, but it's something that's hard for us sometimes to wrap our head around. Think about words that we use instead, the character, or good traits, personality. Those are things that are structured by virtue. So the Stoics said that virtue and the things that go along with it, like emotions, thoughts, actions, those are what is good, and those are also what is bad. So the good and the bad lie primarily in the human person and his or her actions, his or her motivations, his or her thoughts, and feelings. The Stoics said some feelings are good, some feelings are bad. Bad for us. So strictly speaking, it's moral character. They understood this in a variety of different ways. Sometimes they would talk about living in accordance with nature. That requires a little bit of explanation. Later on, one of the people who you studied, Epictetus, talks about having one's faculty of choice in accordance with nature. Sometimes it's translated as will, although it's going a bit too far. But what it is in us that chooses should be in accordance with nature. And not just nature like nature red in tooth and claw. You guys heard that expression before? Everybody's out to screw everybody else. That's not what the Stoics mean by nature. That's the screwed up world. Nature means a properly developed human nature. What it is that we have the potential to be. What it is that people that we look up to actually exhibit. So everything else is what they called indifferent. This is, I think, where the Stoics lose a lot of people. If you look at what they include in the realm of indifference, they say things like life is an indifferent. It's better to die virtuous than to live vicious, they would say. That's a hard one to buy, I think, for a lot of people. Health. Health is an indifferent. In illness, its opposite is an indifferent. Beauty, physical attractiveness. Strength. Pleasure and pain are indifferents. Wealth. Fame, or as we would call it today, celebrity, right? Whether you're on TV or not. How many likes you get on your Facebook posts. Facebook doesn't have dislike. It has the angry thing now instead. But like if you're on Reddit, you can get downvoted, right? That's an indifferent to the Stoics. The family that you're born into, the social class that you inhabit, all these things, it's not to say that they're bad, they're just not morally valuable. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated than that, because then the Stoics go and say, well, some of these are what we call preferred, and they sort of made up terminology when they didn't have the right terms. Some of these are preferred indifference because they can lead to virtue. It's easier in some respects if you're healthy to live a virtuous life than if you're constantly sick and being driven nuts by it. For example, the Stoics thought that anger was a bad thing in general. We can talk a little bit more about that later on if you want to. But just sort of start with that principle. Anger is a bad thing. When you're sick, don't you lose your temper more easily? When you're healthy, it's hopefully you don't lose your temper quite so quickly. It doesn't make you emboldened to lose your temper. Okay, so there's a lot of things where these indifference could in fact serve the good or serve the bad, but by themselves they're not really valuable. And so the Stoics think that people who say that earning wealth is the end of everything, and you measure a person's worth by their wealth, the Stoics say those people are actually mixed up. They're in a bad state. They are in a vice of the opposite of wisdom, foolishness. And we could say that for a lot of other things as well. So, this is a point where I think a lot of people say, well, that sounds very harsh. And we'll see how harsh it is as we get to it. So that's another good place, I think, to pause. How many of you think that at this point you could sort of get behind that? You could say, what fundamentally matters is character, whether you're virtuous or vicious, and everything else is we'll make it a little bit easier for you. Everything else isn't strictly speaking indifferent, but it doesn't matter as much as your character. How many of you could buy into that? Not that many. Some. Okay. How many of you could actually go the whole Stoic route and say, just virtue and vice, that's the only thing that matters. Wealth doesn't matter to me at all. Health is indifferent. I can be just as happy, ill as I am healthy. No takers?
Can I follow up on that comment?
Yeah.
Like when the Stoics say health is an indifferent, just characterized. I always struggle with that idea. I mean, it makes sense from the standpoint of what's up to us or not up to us, that distinction that they make. But health is something we can willfully kind of influence quite significantly, right? So I was thinking, how do we work that out? I mean, it seems like it is up to us to some degree, and therefore it's not an indifferent in that sense. It's something that we can control.
So it gets a little bit more complicated. And the next thing we'll talk about is what's in our control and what's not in our control. But there's two things to be said about health. One is that the Stoics say you do actually have a responsibility to maintain your body in health because it's part of what you've got. The things that are indifferent are external, including your body, but our use of them is not indifferent. So it's sort of like think about your body as like a lawnmower. No, a lawnmower doesn't do as much as your body, but right. When you put your lawnmower away, do you clean the stuff out from the bottom? You don't? I do.
That's why it always jams. Yeah.
Well, there you go, right? And so if it jams when you need it not to jam, that's your fault, right? Now, if the manufacturer left out a bolt or something and it shakes itself apart, well, that's not your problem at all, right? I mean, your body, there's lots of things that eventually go wrong. Those of you who are young, fortunately, you're not experiencing too much of this at this point, but you will sooner or later. All sorts of crazy things that you wouldn't have any idea could go wrong with your body start going off here and there. And that's not really, you can make sure that you're eating a proper diet, right? You're exercising. Like say if you don't want to get diabetes, right? What shouldn't you do if you don't want to get diabetes? Say drink 2 liter gallons of soda, 2 liter bottles of soda a day. You don't want to get diabetes? That's probably a good place to start, right? There's other things you can do as well. But you can do all those things and you can still get diabetes. And then you have a choice, how do you manage your diabetes? Do you say, oh, well, I'm going to eat as much and drink as much as I can because who knows, I might die tomorrow from it. Or do you say, well, I think I probably need to change my diet. These are real life things that people go through. These are ethical questions too, by the way. So let's jump into
temporary health.
Yeah, go ahead.
As you hear, is indifferent.
Yeah.
Is bodily health.
Yeah.
I mean, the different kinds of nature.
Yes.
Would already, as you suggested, imply what we're looking at is a well-ordered or healthy soul.
Yeah.
Rather than just whatever we happen to be, whatever we're given to be.
Yeah, and usually we start out with it. By the time we start looking at ethics, we're usually kind of screwed up. Right?
So does Stoicism presuppose already a mind-body distinction?
They play off of it.
Or a soul-body distinction.
You can say they play off of it, but ultimately the Stoics are materialists. So they see the body and the soul as composed of the same kinds of substance, but you could say that rather than being a separation, there is a distinction. Do you guys understand that way of? So instead of saying the soul and the body are two different things, they can be distinguished from each other. One we certainly have more control over than the other, right? Although even until we work our problems through, a lot of things within our minds are only partly within our control. You know, like if I have a bad temper because I grew up in a household where everybody shouted at each other and people routinely punched each other in the nose, which thank goodness I didn't. The first yes, the second no. I'm going to have a lot of work to do in order to have a healthy, well-ordered soul. It's not going to be like snapping my fingers and suddenly I have it, whereas my body, is less in my control. Does that answer adequately, or?
Well, it goes in another direction that I'd like to ask.
Sure.
Anger is something that leads astray.
Yeah.
Where does righteous indignation fit into that?
Stoics don't think there is
I was going to ask that question.
Yeah,
too.
I mean, this.
Sorry, did I rob you?
No, righteous anger. I
Yeah.
thought of that very thing. When
This
you
is
were
one of
talking
those issues on which the Stoics were like the arch enemies of the Aristotelians. And this is actually one of the areas in which I do a lot of my work. It's how I got interested in the Stoics in the first place. Stoics are uncompromising. Anger is always bad. And that's pretty hard to swallow, because what we sometimes call righteous indignation. There's arguments that they give, like Seneca says, anything you can do under the influence of anger, you can do better without feeling anger, but acting according to reason, what reason tells you ought to do. He does say that a judge should probably appear to be angry, but don't actually be angry, so that the criminals will, straighten their ways a bit better. But they're uncompromising about anger being bad. And I think in the modern adaptations, there's some leeway for anger, but it's still, even for the Aristotelians, most instances of anger are bad. It's usually something we need to put away. So let's talk about what's in our control and what's not in our control then. So the Stoics make a really strong distinction between the things that are in our control, up to us, another way of translating our business, and the things that aren't in our control. And we make mistakes from a moral perspective that are damaging to ourselves when we get these mixed up. So if we think that things that really are not in our control are in our control. And anger is a great example of this, because when we get angry, we often feel like we control the situation more than we do. Like somehow yelling at this person is going to produce the response that we want from them, and they'll realize that they were wrong and apologize to us. Almost never works, right? But we still keep doing it. We're mixing up things that are in our control and not in our control. And if we treat things that are not in our control as if, according to the Stoics, as if they're genuinely good things, our desire naturally goes out to them and steers us to pursue those things. If we think that wealth is intrinsically valuable, then we will naturally sacrifice other things for wealth. If we think that social approval is intrinsically valuable, or even useful to getting wealth or something else, then we're going to pursue that. And so if we get mixed up about this, we're going to pursue the wrong things. We're also going to try to avoid the wrong things too. If we think that social disapproval is the worst thing that could possibly happen to us, which is a fairly common human view about things, then that can keep us from actually doing what we're supposed to do. And that's damaging to ourselves. It's also going to be damaging to others. So we can actually give our minds over to things that are outside of our control. And this happens sometimes when we, expect, as Epictetus says, things to go the way that we want them to go in the universe. So for example, I'll use a really silly example. I get upset with inanimate objects a lot more than I should. So I've got this nice, dossier here, and I don't even have to use the water bottle, which irritated me earlier today. I'll just use this. So this flap here, it doesn't sit the way that I like it exactly, and sometimes it's in the way. And I don't, fortunately, I'm not like I was when I was a kid, where I'd probably kick it or hit it or, things like that. But I do get irritated like if it doesn't sit on the car seat the right way. Now that's stupid. That's just completely, from a Stoic perspective, I'm really badly off. You know, this thing has no control over how it behaves. It's purely mechanical, right? If I don't want it to behave in a certain way, maybe I can take a little thought and not sit it up in this way, or not have the expectation that it has to unfold itself exactly the way I want it to. So that's one thing. The other thing that comes up a lot is when we try to get things that other people have control over. What would those sort of things be? What don't you control in your own life that other people do control? I'll give you a really easy one. In this classroom, right? What don't you control that somebody else controls?
You guys have to know what that is. What kind of power we have.
Yeah.
Grades.
I don't have that control. I'm not grading it. What else? Why can't you just get up and leave if you're bored with this? You know? Or why can't you ask me a question, you know, whenever you want to? Because you care a little bit, at least, about what I think, don't you? And in part because you're polite, and that's good. I'm not complaining about that, right? There's a lot of things like this. Con artists work on us by getting us to agree to all sorts of things that we shouldn't agree to because we care about their approval, and we shouldn't care about most people's approval. We should care about our own approval of ourselves or disapproval. Or those few people who we actually think have their heads screwed on right, who can give us valuable advice and assessments of ourselves. But to worry, for example, how many of you have social media? Everybody? I mean, I have Facebook, Google+, Twitter, sometimes I get on Reddit, and I have LinkedIn. And I post on all of them. How many of you ever got upset when you posted something really cool and nobody liked it or followed it or tweeted it or go down the line?
Come on.
Only one of you? Only two?
Nobody wants to admit it.
All right, so we know that some people are just, more invested in thinking that they don't do that than admitting it, right? From a Stoic perspective, that's something that's in somebody else's control. Epictetus goes so far as to say, we make ourselves the slave of the other person when we try to seek something that's in their control. It can be grades, it can be any sort of gatekeeping thing, it can be who gives you a job, it can be who's going to pay you, it can be approval, it can be all sorts of things. We're making a mistake, again, from a Stoic perspective, when we do that. Now, does that mean that we shouldn't care about the outside world at all? This goes to the sort of questions, not just about health, but about wealth and reputation. No, because our use of externals does, in fact, fall in our control. So we can use them well or use them poorly. We can use wealth well or use wealth poorly. What would be an example of using wealth well at your stage as a student when you don't have a lot of wealth? What's that?
Investing.
Well, if you can do that, that's great, especially at your age, because then you'll actually have something at the end of the day. I'm thinking something a little bit more short term. What is the perennial thing for students?
Actually buying the textbooks.
Yeah, and that's a hard one to swallow too, right? Because they overcharge you in most cases. There's kind of a racket going on with textbooks. I really feel for students when it comes to that sort of thing. What would be a bad use of your money? The scant money that you have as a student, usually. What's that?
I was going to say gambling.
Oh yeah, I wasn't even thinking about that. I was thinking about drinking, especially like drinking in bars. If you're gonna, from a Stoic perspective, if you're gonna spend your money on liquor, drink at home, right? Don't drink at bars. But gambling, yeah, that almost just cuts out the getting anything for it part.
This lady's seen both sides of investment.
That's great.
I'm going to figure that out.
She's thinking big over there.
Yeah. So I mean, these are ways in which we use the resources that we have. And we can think about this in terms of our contacts, we can think about this in terms of our reputation, where we put what we call our social capital, what do we invest it into, or, who do we vouch for. All of that is actually up to us. And this leads us to two other important concerns. Let's talk a little bit more now about the virtues and vices. So the Stoics are virtue ethicists, but they're a weird kind of virtue ethicist in that, for the most part, at least the sort of party line is, you've got virtue and you've got vice, and there's really nothing in between. There's no, like, you're kind of virtuous, kind of vicious. You're either good or you're bad. This is what they call the Stoic paradox. Now, in practice, the Stoics do understand that there is, moral progress. Habits play an important role. Breaking your old bad habits, replacing them with good habits, that's all very important. But the Stoics want to stress, look, you're either making progress towards virtue or you're falling, bless you, you're falling back into vice. And the virtues and vices that they acknowledged were the big four, what we call the cardinal virtues, and then their opposed vices. Wisdom, which includes practical wisdom, thinking about how you ought to run your life, what's good for you. Temperance or moderation, not taking more than is excessive. That has to do with the body, for example. It can conduce to health as well, right? Courage, which they thought was very important. You needed not only to understand what the good is, but to be able to stand up against hostility, against resistance, against temptation when things get tricky. And then justice. And justice is quite interesting because when we hear that word justice, we tend to think of like crime and punishment, or, I owe somebody something. The Stoics distinguished between justice in that sort of strict sense, and then they also talked about benevolence, doing good for other people as falling under justice. That if we were going to be truly just, it's not just a matter of following the rules and not screwing anybody over, not breaking any rules or violating any duties, but it's also going beyond and being benevolent to other people. So that's an important way of looking at things. Then the question is, well, how would we develop these? The Stoics placed a really strong emphasis on, like I said, habit, but also on thinking. If we can change our thinking about things, we can change the ways in which we behave, the ways in which we react, and the ways in which we feel. So wisdom really is the most important virtue. It kind of governs the rest of them for the Stoics. And these are, the Stoics think, capacities that we all have within us. So this is another way in which is a bit different than other virtue ethics. Some virtue ethics, like Aristotle's, would say, look, you start out and he doesn't say actually you're a blank slate when it comes to virtue. He says, you don't actually have virtues or vices. You might have like tendencies towards certain behaviors, tendencies towards others. Some people are more irritable than others. Some people are more easygoing than others. But actually developing a real virtue or a vice, that takes some work. That takes some time. That takes some repetition. The Stoics say you have the capacity within you to be virtuous if you choose. So you're always sort of on the hook for it. It may be harder to exercise that capacity for some people than others. Like for me, the reason I got interested in anger to begin with is I have a bad temper. And I still do. I just mostly keep it under control. I haven't turned it into the virtue that would be associated with anger, which is not having a really good temper, right? The Stoics would say, I always have the capacity to not lose my temper if I choose to. That's something that's up to me, but I have to actually decide to do that. And being told that you have the capacity is very liberating, because a lot of times in modern culture, we're told that we don't really have any control over our emotions. They just are the way they are, and that's it. We're stuck with them. Same thing with our desires. We're often told that we just desire the things that we do, and we have to follow out our desires. We can do it in a rational way or an irrational way, but we're stuck with these particular desires. Stoicism says, no, we are responsible for those, and we can steer those in a virtuous way or vicious ways. So this requires choices to be made, determinative choices. Easier, by the way, to make when you're your age, the Stoics think, than when you're our age. when your character is already a bit more fixed. So you have a better shot at it than we do.
You get to the point where your vigor falls off, and then it's irrelevant.
Desires go away altogether.
That's right.
Yeah. So the last thing that I think is really useful to take away from, if you want to say, I understand something about Stoic ethics, you notice that Epictetus talks a lot about duties. And he says at one point that our duties are measured by our roles and our relationships. So this is where we see a connection, not just ourself and sort of I need to figure out what's really in my power, what's not in my power, how I can be virtuous, all that sort of stuff. That looks like I withdraw from the world. How do we engage with other people? That's where the Stoics thought that duty is particularly important. So other people are, strictly speaking, external to us, right? I don't decide whether you are a good person or a bad person. So it shouldn't really affect me. But I do have certain duties towards you. For example, if I'd shown up and I was, drunk and didn't have any notes and just stood up here and told jokes, how would you like that? Maybe some of you would. It'd be a nice break from classes. I think some of you'd be like, what is wrong with this guy? He was supposed to, what? Come here and tell us about something. I have certain duties as a speaker to an audience. All of us inhabit all these roles, right? I'm a father and a son and a sibling, so there's these familial roles. I'm also a educator. I suppose that becomes with a whole bunch of other roles. I have a business. It's just a mom and pop thing, so we don't have employees that I have to worry about, but clients. And then we have roles like being a fellow citizen, neighbor, friend. With each of those come obligations to the other person. And the Stoics say, it's up to you whether you recognize and fulfill those obligations. And we're often placed in situations where we don't want to. Why not? Let me take one thing off the board. We often have situations where fulfilling obligations is just kind of a pain, and it requires us to not do something else that we'd like to do, and so we're not acting like a good son or daughter or a good mom or dad some of the time because of that. But why else? What makes us really say, well, I'm not going to behave that way towards that person? When do we most make excuses for ourselves?
When they're not fulfilling their end of the deal.
Exactly, yeah. So Epictetus talks about a guy who has a brother, and the brother is acting like a jerk, and he's not being a very good brother at all. And Epictetus says to him, well, you have a choice. Just because he acts like a jerk doesn't mean that you should act like a jerk in turn, because the logic behind that is, well, he's damaging himself. He's damaging the good person inside of him who he could have chosen to be. So in response to that, I'm going to wreck the good person inside of myself, and I'm not going to be a brother to him. The Stoics say that's crazy. That's foolishness. Instead, we have control over how we fulfill our duties to other people. Does that mean that we should just allow them to walk all over us and take advantage of us? What do you think? Do you think the Stoics would say that it would lead to that? It sounds kind of like that, doesn't it?
As long as you're maintaining your own virtue, I suppose, it doesn't matter. The external's not different.
Yeah, in some cases. There's some people though that are really, they see you doing that and they're like, man, now I can totally take advantage of her, right? So, the Stoics are not saying you shouldn't have any proper boundaries. Sometimes you shouldn't break off a relationship. Think about say, an abusive relationship with a boyfriend or girlfriend who's constantly taking advantage of you being a Stoic, right? At a certain point, you do actually have to say no. Why? Because you also have duties to yourself. You shouldn't have to put up with that sort of thing. But the Stoics are going to counsel a lot more forgiving people, giving people the benefit of the doubt, trying to be empathetic, trying to understand their position. It doesn't mean that you don't say to them, hey, you're being a jerk, but there's no expectation that by you telling somebody that they're acting like a jerk, that they're automatically going to change. And so this can actually lead to a lot more peace of mind for yourself. And it's through fulfilling our duties that we, in fact, live out the virtues. So,
Is that the point?
Is that the point?
If you refuse to become a jerk toward your brother because he's a jerk, but if you do, that makes you less of a person.
Yeah.
Is that a totally selfish motivation?
No.
You're not doing it out of an obligation of brotherly love or affection. You're doing it in order not to diminish yourself.
Yeah, this is one of those cases where, our common way of like opposing selfishness versus other-centeredness just breaks down. The Stoics, and this holds for a lot of other virtue ethics too. The Stoics would say that, when it comes to certain things, that opposition between like being totally selfish and caring about the other, being concerned about the other, that does hold, like say with wealth, right? But when it comes to the genuine good and living a rational life in as much harmony with other people as we can, I'm actually benefiting them by working on my own character. It's not just, and this is where a lot of...
Is that just incidental?
No, very clearly not for the Stoics. They say things like that time and time and time again. It's not, as Epictetus will say, maintaining the person of fidelity. He likes that term a lot, pistis, within a person, within myself. The person who actually fulfills obligations. It's not something, it is something that I can take pleasure in myself, and I can say I'm a great guy and I like who I am, but it's not, if it was just for that reason, I'd have lost sight of what I'm doing. I wouldn't really be maintaining that person within myself. And inevitably contradictions would arise that would show that. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm becoming part of a whole, a rational whole. This is actually where I was going to move towards this, that we all can participate in. The Stoics talk in terms of the Stoics are the ones who use this term cosmopolitanism. I know we associate with a drink and a magazine, right? But cosmopolitan really means citizen of the world. Somebody who sees the whole world as filled with fellow human beings to whom they can have good relations if those other human beings are up to it. And the Stoics would talk in terms of a kingdom of all rational beings. This is where it gets very deontological, right? Very much like Kant. To work upon myself and to make myself less of a screw-up than I am means to be able to participate more fully in that commonwealth. Now, that there may not be a lot of people in that commonwealth. You may inhabit a society where everybody's crazy and everybody's making the wrong choices and the whole culture is against you. And I'm not just thinking about, say, like American consumeristic society with, advertisements in your face all the time designed to arouse your desires as much as possible. That's already tough. But think about living in a totalitarian society, where questioning the government will get you killed and get your family killed. And the media is not just giving you sort of a mishmash of stuff that's probably not very edifying, and it tends to be very commercial driven, but it has a very clear message. The state is what matters, and you don't matter at all.
And being a good citizen means being willing to rat on your friends and family.
Yeah, it'd be very difficult, I think, in a situation like that to develop properly. And so, if you inhabit a society like that, it's not that it's totally impossible, because there's always some people who are like, no, there's something more than this. But it's very, very difficult.
To me, that's where Stoicism is particularly attractive, though, too.
Yeah.
In the sense of, I feel like if I was a Stoic, I'd have an easier time in a totalitarian kind of situation, just for the fact that they counsel in that instance that detachment, right? A sense that of what you control, what you have within your control, the less and less you have within your control in that general commonwealth, right? You can cultivate your own
everything
virtuous
has been
self.
taken away from you, man.
Yeah, you're cultivating your own virtuous self, but the commonwealth is broken or something, right? It seems like that's an easier thing to reconcile for a Stoic than maybe for other philosophers. I don't know if that's true.
Well, one of the famous 20th century Stoics is Admiral Stockdale, and he wrote this very famous piece talking about how he applied Epictetus' Enchiridion in a Vietnamese prisoner of war camp, where they did horrible things to these prisoners, just to screw with them and to try to break them down. And he said Stoicism is very useful for environments like that. The trouble is, just like Epictetus says this, just knowing what the Enchiridion says, that's not going to work for very long. You have to have made it part of yourself. And this holds for any system of ethics, though. So this is a good place to close and take any final questions. Any moral theory, any system of ethics only really works when it has become part of the fabric of who you are, when it's not just something in a book, but it's something that you practice and something that you make progress in and something that you reflect on. That means, and this is the last thing I'd really like to say, and I think this is probably, when it comes to that sort of stuff, the most important thing. If you're going to be a person who tries to live a thoughtful, ethical life, you're going to screw up much of the time. You're going to fail, and then where ethics really gets interesting is what you do with your failure, how you get yourself back up. Epictetus says it's just like being a wrestler. Get knocked down 6 times, get up 7, and get back in the ring, and that's how you get stronger. And that's one of the things that I think often gets left out in teaching ethics, right? The fact that you will fail, and what counts the most is what you do after that. Whether you say, oh, well, it's too hard, I give up, or whether you say, aha, what can I fix? What can I do differently next time? What do I need to rethink? What resources do I need? So what questions do you guys have about Stoic ethics? Or is this too overwhelming? Or?
They usually leave at 10 too.
Okay.
And I may fail to remind you that just because they're passing between classes. So
yeah,
but
I'm not going to hold on to anybody who wants to go. But any questions that you've got, I'm happy to answer. If any occur to you, my email is there on the handout, so you can always email them to me, and I'll be happy to answer them. Yes.
Where do Stoics believe their virtue of themselves comes from? Do they think that they're born with it, or is it from the environment that they grow up in? Because when we're talking about healthcare, if you're thinking about environment and different situations you're living in, if you're wealthy, then you get access to good healthcare, good education, and you have more exposure to different ideas and beliefs, apart from those who don't. So I just what's the difference, or how do they go about that?
So there's 2 things to say about that. One, to answer the question, where does virtue come from?
Yeah.
It's a capacity within us, and if you think about it, the capacities within you are not radically different than the capacities within me, because we're rational human beings. So we share a common nature. But if you develop justice and I don't, well, justice, actually exists in you, and I've managed to ruin it within myself, right? And you could be as just as you want, and it wouldn't necessarily make me any more just. So where does it exist?
Around?
Where I could be the just one?
Well, no, if you don't have justice within you, can't you build it?
Oh yes, and that's one of the things that I think is very optimistic about the Stoic viewpoint. That if you realize that you're vicious, that's not the end of the story. It's like, oh, I'm vicious, forget it, I'm done, right? No, then if you actually care about that, you know, wow, I don't really want to be vicious anymore. I need to. And then there's questions like, well, what resources do you have? So the Stoics offer teachings. There's like actual practices that they use to try to cultivate these sorts of things. Like, for example, taking stock of the day at the end of the day and thinking about what you did well and what you did poorly. That got assimilated later on into the Christian examination of conscience as a common practice, but the Stoics were doing that earlier. Now, to the other thing about, let's call it social inequalities, right? And the fact that some people have much better situations that may conduce to them being more virtuous than others, or it may not. Because, if you grew up in a wealthy household, there's more temptations. There's more things you can easily lose yourself in as well. And it depends on having people, I think, in your life who are going to steer you the right way. And I mean, that's one thing we can say as sort of a constant over time, looking at it cross-culturally and throughout history, the wealthy aren't usually any better morally than the rest of us. And that also means that they're not usually much worse. There's kind of a smattering. Some of them are really great people, and they manage to use their wealth really well, and sterling examples. Some of them are just terrible people. But then some of the people who are poor would be the same terrible people if you gave them some money, and some of them would be really, really good. But there are other things, like you're saying, like healthcare, right? Big issue for us. We don't have equal access to healthcare. And not even, I live in Wisconsin. I think we're better off than you guys are here in Illinois, in part because your state is bankrupt. And we're not, But it's still not great for us, unless you buy the very expensive plans. Now, what would a Stoic have to say about that? I think a Stoic, if we look at the Stoics who actually lived, they would be for fixing that sort of stuff. They would want to see like the healthcare system be equalized so that people who are rich don't get way better healthcare than other people. They would be for making society better. Now that doesn't necessarily lead to any particular political doctrine. There's been a lot of discussions in the Stoic forums about, well, should a Stoic vote for this party or this party? And it doesn't really translate quite like that. I think it'd be more like an issue-by-issue voting. The Stoics also thought you should participate in politics. That if you're in a society where you have a role of being a citizen, that you should actually participate. You should vote. You should take office if you can and make things better. That's kind of an interesting point.
I think we can thank our speaker.
Thanks.